Thank you so
Right.
much, Dr. Jodi Pawluski. We are speaking with Dr. Pawluski, who is a neuroscientist and a therapist and an author. And this is on behalf of Families for Depression Awareness. A little bit of background, Dr. Pawluski is this amazing neuroscientist that I have been admiring and reading her work since I was a grad student during my PhD work. And she has just been an amazing advocate for mothers and especially for maternal mental health. So thank you
Thanks.
for joining us, Dr. Paluski at
Thank
FFDA.
you. Thank you, Rose. Thank you for the lovely introduction and for reading my papers, some of the stuff I've been trying to, get out there and get people really having these types of conversations, which we're going to be having around perinatal mental health and motherhood and the brain. And I think it's really, really important to understand what happens during this transition, which many, many people go through, right? Many people will have children. And so I think that this is,
Definitely.
yeah, really important to talk about the mental illness that so often happens, especially in moms and in dads as well. But yeah, so I'm
Absolutely.
happy to be here.
Yeah, and I recently read her book, Mommy Brain. And as a recent mother myself, I have a 2-year old. This was really enlightening. And even though I studied neuroscience, I still learned so many valuable information in the book. So diving into you and learning more about you,
Yeah.
would you be able to tell us a little bit more about your background and what led you to study neuroscience or motherhood especially?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, from a very young age, I was really interested in how things worked or how animals worked. So I grew up on a small farm and we always had babies around in the spring, baby chicks and other animals. And I was always really curious about how that worked. And I remember asking my grandma how a chicken worked one day. And my grandma grew up on a farm in northern Alberta in Canada. And my grandpa was a farmer. And so she drew me this little picture. I can still picture it. I wish I had saved it, but I was about 5, of course. I didn't see the value of it, but about, with a little chicken with all the organs and the brain and what have you. And I was just really curious about this, yeah, how we work, how we behave, right? And then as I went into graduate school, or not graduate school, in my undergrad, I did a degree in biopsychology, which is the link between kind of biology and psychology. And we did a lot of work on hormones. And I found this really fascinating, right? The way hormones can affect our brain and behavior.
Mm.
And then I got really, really curious in parenting, and parenting specifically, not child development. So I worked in a language development lab as an undergrad, and we were studying how parents kind of help kids learn language. And I was like, this is so fascinating, this parent role. And then I was just really wanted to get more into hormones, brain, and behavior, and that intersection of those factors across pregnancy and motherhood. And I went to graduate school and was able to do some work on memory and motherhood and reproductive experience and the hippocampus, a brain area important for motherhood. Well, not important for motherhood, it's important for many things, but it's important for memory and stress regulation and also affected by hormones. And so I did a lot of work on this and then moved more so to perinatal mental illness and animal models of it, and also working with human population a bit and trying to understand kind of the intersection of, brain, hormones, behavior in this context. But it really came from I think a curiosity of what's going on. And then I'm like fascinated really by pregnancy and parenting. Like it's pretty fascinating if we just think of it from like a biological perspective. But then you also think about all the factors that have to go right, but all the factors that also can go wrong, right? And I think,
Right.
every mother should really have the support she needs to feel healthy. And so we need to do research and provide options so that can happen. So, yeah.
Absolutely. That's really fascinating. Have you shared with your grandmother that story of how it all really started with chickens?
Yeah, I know. Hey, and I have chickens too, and I love watching them. They're hilarious when they have baby chicks and everything. Um, I'm still a big like animal watcher, but yeah, my grandma unfortunately passed away a number of years ago.
Yeah,
And yeah, I think as time passes, you start to realize how important certain figures are in your life or were growing
right.
up. I think she knew the important role she played, but yeah, I never had the chance to talk with her specifically about that story. So, but yeah, she's definitely there somewhere. Parts of her are in me, of course,
Mm,
genetically speaking,
definitely.
but also what
Yeah,
I learned from her, right? So,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
And
really
I also,
amazing.
yeah, I also want to add that I am a mother, but I actually wasn't
Mhm.
interested in motherhood. Um, like I was interested in motherhood before I ever had kids. So it wasn't the reason
Right.
why I do this research at all. It actually came from a whole other experience of my life. And sometimes people are surprised by that, or they assume that because we become mothers, we're now interested in doing the research on it. But it's
That's
actually,
true. Yes.
yeah, it's actually quite fascinating just to study it without having kids. And I have many colleagues that do that, and they're
Yeah,
men or don't have children or what have you, because it is a fascinating area of research. So,
it really is. And how, I guess, what other aspects of your life inspired you to then write your book, Mommy Brain, Discover the Amazing Power of Maternal Brain?
yeah. So, in fact, in 2017, I had the fortunate opportunity to co-author a review paper for a scientific journal, Trends in Neuroscience, and with Joe Lonstein and Alison Fleming, both super researchers in the parental brain world. And so we worked
Right.
on this paper and it was titled "The Neurobiology of Postpartum Anxiety and Depression." And, we covered mostly I will say, very limited research in humans around how the brain changes with postpartum anxiety and depression. And thankfully, since 2017, there's been really an increase in research in this area. But we did this
Definitely.
review article, and it was really interesting because at that time it got a lot of popular press. Like we had journalists contacting us, authors and what have you, and it made me realize how much people want to know about this area of research, like how the brain changes with perinatal mental illness. And so that was kind of a springboard. I, accepted podcast interviews and was talking about our paper, and we wrote a couple editorials of follow-up and opinions about this, and so that's really where it started, where we started to have this contact from the public because of the interest in this area. And I ended up doing a podcast episode here in France. I'm based in France, but I'm originally from Canada. And from there, someone approached me and asked me to write a book. And I was like,
Mm.
I don't know. Like, I'm a scientist. Like, I don't know if this is what is going to work out for me. And a book in French, and I don't write in French. Yeah, my French isn't that good.
Wow.
But what they did is had me team up with kind of well, she essentially translated what I wrote. So the original version was published in French, but written in English, and then I had it
I see.
published in English. So it was, yeah, I mean, I knew the importance of the topic, and I felt the desire,
Mhm.
like how the public needs to know this and how much they
Right.
desired it. But I, of course, had doubts about this being something I could do, right? But
Yes,
fortunately, I had like some support, and I was like, okay, let's do it and see what happens. So,
definitely.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's a bit of
were
a
you
scary
surprised by
adventure.
the reception?
Yeah, I was really surprised. I was really surprised. I was like, it must be a slow news day that they've picked up our review, you know? Like,
Well, it was
this
just
sometimes
written really
happens.
well.
Yeah, you're because this happens in science sometimes. Like you don't know which study is necessarily going to be super popular. And I mean, we
True,
wrote a
yes.
review. It wasn't an original scientific paper. So it,
Right.
it was, yeah, I mean, it was surprising, but it was also so nice to see because this is a topic that's been so sorely neglected, right? Is like really the neurobiology of perinatal mental illness. And, we don't study parenting enough and motherhood enough and the biology of it.
Right.
And so, yeah, it was really nice to to actually see the interest and then see from then to now, in fact, how much the field has started to change in terms of the neuroscience of parenting and understanding how the brain changes with perinatal mental illness, and the interest from the public. So yeah, it was a surprise. And then yeah, with the book, I mean, that was a whole new venture for me. Scary in many ways.
Definitely. Yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
but I put it
loved
out
your
there.
book. Yeah, it
Thank
was it's
you.
written so nicely and just so thoroughly. And what I really appreciated was how you even mentioned how the government didn't really even implement or at least encourage scientists to include, studying female brain, female behavior until recently. Would you mind going over a little bit more about that and how you think that has changed the trajectory of the field?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think when it comes to biomedical research in general, I mean, I'm hoping we all know the stats now that in fact
Right.
much of the research has been done in males traditionally. And so now there's been a shift because of government agencies in the United States and in Canada uh, wanting to see results of the scientific studies done in both males and females. And in Europe, we also have a recommendation to do both males and females. So there's been a shift because we've realized, that males and females are different. I mean, they're very
Yes.
similar in many ways, but there
Right.
are differences, right? So their brains are actually quite similar, but they're not identical. And of
Yes.
course, our physiological processes are a bit different, right? I mean, we have different hormones, or we have the same hormones, but at different levels, right?
Yes,
And so there's
absolutely.
all these different factors. Our bodies are slightly, on average, there's a lot of overlap, but there's some differences. And so I think we started to see the need to really understand a female body and brain. And I think that's been really important. But on the flip side, when it comes to like the maternal brain field or the parental brain field, it actually has been focused on mothers and less so on
Mhm.
fathers, because it was always research kind of geared towards caregiving, right? And in most
Absolutely.
mammals, the mother is the primary caregiver. So most laboratory rats, for example. And so that was actually it's been a different switch or the opposite, where now there's more research starting to come out on fathers in the area
Yes,
of the parental brain. So, which is also very valuable. But I think we need to study sex and gender, right, as factors when we're looking at
definitely.
anything. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was really surprising to me too when I was in grad school learning about, postpartum depression, yes, in mothers, but also fathers as well. And so
Yeah.
that we don't really talk about that as much. And so including both sexes in research really is valuable. And so that we can have this um a better understanding of how we can be better caregivers to our loved ones. In the
Yeah.
process of writing your book, what's what's the most surprising thing that you learned over the course of your research and years of research for this book? And or what do you think people would be surprised to learn from reading this book?
Oh goodness. This is a good question. I mean, I'm still learning so much and I'm still rethinking things,
Exactly.
right? Like
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that's part of it. I think,
Yeah.
I really hope that this book makes people rethink, in fact, what they think about their brain on motherhood, essentially, because there's such a negative connotation to motherhood and the brain, mommy brain, right? It's like your brain's
Yes.
gone to mush and what have you, and it actually hasn't. And so part of really what I want people to take from this book is that, like, to understand the amazing things that actually happen to the brain to make it capable of keeping a human alive, which is a big deal,
Yes.
and also give some kind of science behind this idea of whether or not we are losing our memory as mothers, and what are the factors playing a role there. So there's those two aspects, but also I wrote about perinatal mental illness and I wrote about non-birthing parents because their brain changes
Mhm.
too, although we have less research. But I tried to, provide information on research for adoptive parents, fathers, grandparents, and then with regards to perinatal mental illness and pregnancy loss as well, which isn't a mental illness, but it's a tragic event that
Mhm.
can happen, and link it to what we know about the brain in all of this.
Definitely.
That's the main theme, right? Is to look at how the brain changes. So I wanted to give an overview of information so that people could really rethink, right? Or think
Yes.
about what's going on. I mean, part of also my desire is really for us to move away from having mommy brain denote something really negative, right? To
Absolutely. Yeah.
actually appreciating that our brain is doing a lot of stuff during this time, right? It's rapidly learning how to parent. And so it needs some
Yeah.
space to do that. But I think there's layers of different issues here. There's historical factors, relationship factors, societal factors. And so there's a lot that needs to still be, I guess, pulled apart essentially. But I'm hoping it starts a conversation around all the positive things and the good things that your brain is doing during this time. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and having been, now a mother myself, just the amount of work and the amount of energy it takes raising a baby and infant, they're solely dependent on you for survival. And I really liked what you wrote in the book about how sometimes there's this pressure that, oh, it's always sunny and fun and great and beautiful being a mother, but it's also very, and that's like the societal pressures of, oh, maybe if someone is feeling depressed, but there is a societal pressure that no, you're supposed to be happy, you're a happy mother, and that's not really the case, and that then increases the stigma around seeking mental health, resources and help.
Yeah, definitely. I think, we have such a poor view of what mothers experience, or we expect them to just be happy, right? Oh, but you have a beautiful
Yes.
baby. You should be happy. It's like the
Right.
true
Yeah.
thing. And we're not
Yeah.
accepting of actually the full range of emotions that go with that, which is kind of
Right.
normal to have a full range. It's okay to be sad sometimes. And like when
Absolutely.
you're pregnant, right? Because it's a big deal, or to be super anxious the odd day. I mean, all of these, like, or angry or what have you, you're allowed to have emotions in life. I think actually we forget
Right.
that we are allowed that regardless of whether or not we're going to have a baby. But you don't have to be
Absolutely.
happy all the time. And I think that there's just this kind of pressure for one to be that way. And then if you're not feeling that way, then of course then you're maybe considered a bad parent, or something might be wrong with you. And this is not true. I think there's a healthy range of emotion, but then of course there are illnesses that come up during pregnancy and the postpartum period that have to be dealt with, right? You don't want to feel ill. No one should feel depressed. There's
Right.
options for treatment, right? So, but I think there is this pressure to be a certain way. There's also a huge pressure to really, be the perfect mother, do all these things, be Wonder Woman, right?
Yes.
And this also
Absolutely.
this is not really your role during this time, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
are amazing because you produced a human. That should be kind of enough. And then, but of course, you're not supposed to do this all by yourself. You're not supposed to parent by yourself. We're a social species. So I think we've missed some of these aspects, these important things, when we kind of we have this expectation that's unattainable for mothers in particular,
Absolutely.
right? In terms of how they
Yeah.
manage their journey.
Yes, exactly. And one thing that I was surprised when I was pregnant was the complications that could happen while you're pregnant, and balancing work and going to your appointments in the middle of the day and the hospital being far away from where you work, or just the traveling
Yeah.
aspect. And pregnancy in general can already be so difficult with, morning sickness and all this stuff. And then there's
Yeah.
also the logistical aspect of balancing everything, work, or if you're in grad school, your research, and then also taking care of yourself. And I think having that background, I guess studying pregnancy and postpartum depression, like I also knew that, like, oh, what if my stress hormones are high, or all of that? It's like, how will this be affecting, my baby and
Right.
whatnot? So I guess It's really amazing that one, you're a neuroscientist, but also a therapist and an author. Can you share more in terms of like what are some signs or symptoms that caregivers should be aware of that might indicate that someone is struggling with their mental health?
Yeah, I think this is really important because it's often hard to tell. I will say
Mhm.
it can be very difficult to tell if someone's depressed or anxious. People often hide it really well, and maybe even moms do more so because they're supposed to be happy, right?
Right,
So this can
exactly.
be really challenging, but I think, it's really just a good question to, or, inquire about how she's doing. Often we
Yes.
don't ask mom, and she might not tell you, but maybe it will start a conversation that she hasn't been sleeping well, or she
Mhm.
hasn't been eating, or she hasn't been feeling like going outside, or she's been crying a lot, or maybe she'll start crying, right? And so in the first 2 weeks postpartum, for sure, there's a lot of like emotional ups and downs, but past that time, I think if, there's continued anxiety, continued sadness, continued anger, that these are things that need to be kind of gently inquired about, perhaps, or at least be made, having, someone, a friend or family member be a support person, at least be like, I'm here if you need to talk. So,
Definitely.
yeah, I think this it's difficult. I mean, we do know the signs and symptoms, of course, but it's hard sometimes to see them. So being available,
Yes.
also even like offering stuff, like if she's really tired, I mean, can you do 3 hours at night so she can sleep for the first 3 hours, right? Like 9 to 12. Like, are there things that you could do? It's also really hard for people to accept, mothers to accept help, but there's like, what can
Yes.
you do? And just be like, you know what? I'm going to bring you food tomorrow. Like, sometimes you don't need to ask, but you just need to tell, because by
Yes.
asking, you're also asking her to make a decision, right? Another decision.
Absolutely.
So these are some things that
Yeah.
are important to think about, is just even just being there, dropping off food, not visiting too long unless she would like or what have you. I
Mhm.
mean, I also think there's a really valuable website. It's postpartum.net. It's Postpartum Support International. It also has a
Oh,
lot of
perfect.
different information specific to perinatal mental health. And I think that this is a great resource for individuals. It also has a warm line and an email, so you can contact someone. And there's also a registry of healthcare professionals in your area, right? So, and it's international, so that's a great resource out there. But I think
That's
it's really
wonderful. Yeah.
important, yeah, to check in with. I mean, a lots of times we're not checking in with mom,
Yeah,
right?
that's true. That's true. Yes.
Yeah, we're all about baby. I mean, babies are cute. Let's not, you know, can't deny it, but we need to
Right.
check in with her. And I think that's
Yeah.
a number one thing to do, is just ask, like, how's it been for you?
Yeah, exactly. And you raise a really good point of if a person's very good at masking or at least like not asking for help and just already used to doing everything themselves. Um, I can definitely relate to that. Like I'm very I ever since I was a kid, been very independent and it's been like and so when I was pregnant, I really had to say, "Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you for helping," and like when I worked in a lab and there would be bins that I would need to get, and it's like high up, and our amazing lab techs were like, "Rose, let me get it for you," or like carrying like a bucket of like water, and like doing any kind of experiments, and it really is that it does take a lot more in terms of really asking how a mother is doing, and what you said is beautiful of don't even ask sometimes in terms of if they need help. Like just that added questions like, yes, but no. And so just even like dropping off food or like you said, 9 to 12, the 3 hours of sleep is amazing. Thank you for providing the links. We will add that to the description and
Yeah.
we'll definitely add that. um, what effects can perinatal mental health conditions have on the mother, or at least the birthing parent and their family?
Yeah, so it's very common if one parent is struggling that the other parent is struggling with their mental illness. So this is really important to bring up. There's also often, I mean, in association with the mental illness, there's often relationship issues, whether or not they contributed to the onset or are a function of the illness. I mean, there's usually an association. I mean, it's hard, right? To live
Mhm.
with someone who has a mental illness. So,
Yes,
yeah, and you imagine then adding a baby into the mix,
right.
right? And babies need someone to care for them. So it's quite a different situation. And actually, we're starting to see neurobiologically when it comes to depression during pregnancy or postpartum, the brain is a bit different than what we see in major depression and other times in life, right? I mean, this makes sense because physiologically, there's a lot of differences in pregnancy and postpartum. So it makes difference
Mhm.
a difference, right? Like so it's kind of a unique period in life, and the mental illness itself has some unique attributes and effects. I mean, this is kind of how I think about it. There's a lot of similarities, but there's differences. But when you have a baby in there, it's a big deal, right? So you can see
Yes,
effects on the relationship, of course, effects on her health. I mean, long term, we see increased risk of many poor outcomes for the child often. I mean, it's an increased risk, so there's no guarantee that, just
yeah,
because mom has been struggling with her mental health during the perinatal period, that her child is going to end up poorly developed. But there is this
right.
increased risk, right? And so there's this urgency in a way to, I hope there's an urgency for many of us, there is to, you know,
Yeah,
find support for mom in some way and do more research even to develop better interventions so that we can help her feel well and so that it has less repercussions on the child. I also want to say that a non-birthing parent's mental illness can have an effect on the child too. It's not just about
mhm,
mom or birthing parent. So, when a parent is struggling with their mental health, it affects the family, right? And I think
definitely.
that's really important to remember. And yeah, people shouldn't suffer.
Absolutely. And would you be able to dive a little bit more on the brain regions that you mentioned that is different during the postpartum period?
Yeah. So in general, I mean, there hasn't been, well, there haven't been very many studies, I'll say, that have really compared major depression outside of the perinatal period and then major depression or postpartum depression in terms of neurobiology. And so we really need more research on this. There's been
Mhm,
one study that, in fact, has shown that in the amygdala, which we often think is very important for emotions, but it does many other
mhm.
things. But anyway, it's a hub in the
Yeah,
brain, circuits that are important for parenting and empathy and what have you. It's an important brain area that also gets a lot of research time. So people like to look at it. But what's interesting is the amygdala seems to be activated in a different way in a woman that has postpartum depression compared to a non-mother female that has major depression. So it's more reactive or more active when looking at a picture of a baby, whether it's their own baby or another baby. And this is work by Dr. Aya Duden and Alison Fleming from a couple of
mhm,
years ago. So this has really been the first study that compared depression in the postpartum with depression in non-mothers and showing that the amygdala is acting in a different way. I mean, there's also some other, if we do some rough comparisons, we start to see there's some other brain areas, very like many similar brain areas are involved in both depression at other times in life and depression in the postpartum, but the way they're functioning can be quite different. And of course, the way the brain functions when you become a parent in response to a baby is very different than the way the brain functions in a non-parent in response to a baby. So it's not a surprise that there's some differences there in functionality. I mean, this is when we're talking about human brains, but of course, in
right,
animal research, we know that there can be a lot of differences in neurophysiology as well. Yeah.
definitely. Yeah, it's really fascinating in terms of how, I guess, would you think that it's appropriate to say like how the brain changes and like different brain regions change during the postpartum period or at least perinatal period? And I guess the one of the questions that I have received and have gotten from people is, so the brain changes, during the perinatal period. Does the brain go back to how it
Oh, yeah.
was before? And I
So,
know you
yeah.
covered this in the book, and I actually really like how you described it too.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, before I get into that question, I also want to say when we're talking about perinatal mental illness, a lot of the times when we're talking about the brain and these studies on how the brain changes, it's in association with mood symptoms. So we don't know if the changes in the brain came first, or we still don't know how the neurobiology, the progression of it over time with the mental illness, how that overlaps. So just to clarify that. Now, in terms of the brain, yeah, because we know the brain changes in structure and function, particularly or most significantly in a birthing parent. Um, and yeah, this is a question that always comes up, right? Because it's like, will it go back to normal? I was like, I had this question once from a reporter, a journalist or something. And she's like, yeah, but it's just the first 2 years. That's a big deal, right? And I'm like, okay, well, I still call my mom probably most days, and I'm like not two anymore. I mean, once you're a
Yeah,
parent, you're always
exactly.
a parent, right?
Yep,
So, yeah, so this is it. But of course, over time, the idea is and we need more research on this, but over time, of course, your brain is going to be a bit different or respond differently because of the needs of your child, right? And, other
absolutely.
factors in your environment, how many kids you might have, how much support you have with parenting or what have you. But we do know the research is showing that, parenting essentially marks your brain forever, right?
Absolutely. Yes,
But
yeah.
I don't, I would hope that that's not a surprise.
Right, exactly.
And it's
Thank
not a
you.
bad
Yeah,
thing. It's not a bad thing, right?
it's not a bad thing. And I think that's the possible misconception is like, oh, my brain is, or like, has changed in parenting, but it's like it's not necessarily a bad thing. It could be, very
Yeah.
adaptive.
And I think this comes with this whole mummy brain idea, right? That your brain goes to
Yes.
mush when you have a child and then it's going to stay mushy forever. Your brain actually doesn't go to mush when you have a child. It's doing a lot of stuff. It's maybe redirecting its attention to
Mhm.
learning how to care for baby. It's fine tuning. I think there's like, I mean, I talk about the research on this idea of mommy brain in the book, and I've even learned more since I've written it. But I mean, we need more research on really what's going on with when we think about or when we're experiencing our dysfunction in our brains, right? And what factors are
Absolutely.
playing a role, whether it's society's expectations or is it really happening, or are we just doing too much and our brain is just not working, right? Because that's normal for everyone.
Yes, yes,
So,
absolutely. Lack of sleep
yeah,
and all of those
all
other
of those
external
things,
factors.
yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
which haven't been
Uh,
investigated really well. But I think, I mean, yeah, of course your brain is changing. You've got
yeah,
this relationship with this human that's related to you that you created, and yeah,
yes,
it's supposed to change. Your brain
absolutely.
as that relationship grows and as your child grows, right? I don't know, it's a good
Yeah,
thing.
it is a good thing. Yes, yeah. Um, are there, specifically for postpartum depression, are there other strategies that caregivers can use to effectively support parents? You mentioned, they can look at the website.
Oh, yeah.
Are there specific ones that you think would be most effective, especially if someone is watching this video right now and they suspect, are there things that they can do immediately and like long term?
I mean, if the individual, like the parent is open to it, there is a questionnaire online, the Edinburgh Perinatal Depression Questionnaire, EPDS.
Mhm.
It is 10 questions, multiple choice, and it can give you a really good idea of where you're at in terms of depression, in particular perinatal depression. So if the individual is open to this, you can find this online in many places and download it or do an online version. Then you can actually see where they're falling, for one. right? Because it has
Awesome.
a score, you get a score. And then
Yes.
it usually breaks it down whether, possible depression, continue care, go see you talk to your doctor and what have you. I also usually check in all the time with four main areas. So one is sleep. I mean, sleep is
Mm,
medicine, right? So
yes.
sleep, it's asking like, how's your sleep been? Do you think you're getting enough? Right? I mean, checking in with sleep. Food, are they eating? Because sometimes people aren't eating or they're eating sporadically or I mean for me, unhealthy eating, I don't know. Eating is important, right? Healthy eating is important, but you can't change your whole routine. So I often am just like, well, can you eat like, I mean, think about this week. Is there something you feel like eating, like a banana? Like, can you have one thing, something colorful every day that's maybe fresh, right? So I always want to approach these things with like no pressure. Like this whole you should be doing this. No, don't say
Yeah.
that. It's just checking in. Like I think it's checking in with sleep, checking in with food, and also asking like, what do you think? Like what can I do? Like, do you feel like having some strawberries? I'll go pick up some strawberries for you, right? If that's
Yeah.
something. Then there's like just getting outside and moving your body or exercise. Like this is actually important for us. It's not going to cure anyone, but we need to move our bodies. We need to see nature. So checking in with that, I often do with clients. And then the other one is, time, social time, enjoyable time, time relaxing. So this is the acronym SELF. That's been
Mm,
used. So S is for sleep, E is for exercise or movement, L is for laughter or relaxation, and then F is for food or nutrition. I have that in I guess the last chapter of the book. I bring that up. Um,
mhm.
I think those are some key things that our brain needs, right? So I don't know
Definitely.
if you can fit that into conversation very easily, but it might
Yeah.
be helpful to have that in mind. Um, I mean, sometimes just going and having a cup of tea, but you do the dishes while they sit, that's nice too, right? I mean, it's
Definitely.
kind of reading the room,
Absolutely.
in
Yeah.
many
And
ways.
having I love that self. We'll add that to the description as
Yeah.
well. But yeah, it seems as though sometimes it could just be very basic things: sleep, laughter, social, that
Yeah.
interaction, and eating and exercising. But yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes that's like the most difficult things that you can, I guess, attain during while you're caring for a baby, but having that extra help and just that extra interaction outside of the baby is really helpful. And I remember my husband just like one day was like, "Go take a bath." I'm like, "Wait, what?" and like
Yeah.
just having that time to myself, even if it was like 10-15 minutes, was so rejuvenating. And so yeah, just even like those simple things can make such a huge difference.
Yeah, yeah. And
um,
this is also, I mean, especially if there's like a partner at home, but maybe the partner's full-time working
right.
full-time. I mean, sometimes watching baby for 15 minutes for a quick shower is like also a good option if the mom wants that or what have you. But
Yeah,
it is hard often help, right? And support
it is.
someone.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so then, I mean, finding maybe something that you think is easy or easily acceptable, or, sometimes you just have to, it depends on maybe your relationship with that person and how well you know them, right? Doesn't have to be a big thing. It can be a really small thing and that can be special. So,
Definitely. Yeah.
yeah.
And this even translates over to a work environment too, because a lot of parents have to go back to work after 6 or 8 weeks,
Yeah.
which is mind blowing to me, considering that sometimes you're not even fully healed yet. And, you
Yeah.
know, 8 weeks and 10, 12 weeks, that's usually the time when you are even more stressed out in terms of caring for your infant. And so I guess this also translates at work. If you have a coworker who recently gave birth, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, just being aware of how impactful it is to have an infant, right? and how,
Definitely.
yeah, it added an extra layer, on, an extra piece of the mental load, right? Because
Exactly.
you want to make sure your child is cared for. You're waiting for the phone to ring or what have you. Yeah, and checking in with them. I know, it's really helpful for some to know that there's another parent at work that can kind of listen to them or just offer, space to talk if they ever want to talk about anything or check in with how's it going? Did you find childcare in the end, or how's
Yeah,
that working for you, right?
right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it was really helpful even speaking to other mothers, even just giving that time for them to go to the nursing room, to like breast pump and whatnot. And because it's so difficult, you're so consumed with work, and then you feel this pressure of like, oh, do I have time, or will I be judged to go take time for myself to pump and whatnot.
Oh, yeah. This is interesting because this is more American culture, I think, right? So
Oh,
here we
interesting. Oh, can you dive into this?
Oh, yeah. Because I mean, I'm Canadian. I had one child in Belgium. I lived there, and I had one
Yeah.
in the States. And then we moved back here to France. But for example, in France or in Belgium, their parental leave maybe isn't as long. So here in France, it's about 4 months. But there's childcare.
Wow.
Most people have access to childcare, which is subsidized. It's usually they're called assistant maternal, so mother
Mhm.
assistants. So they're individuals who have done extra training to care for three children in their home. And so,
Wow.
yeah, three children under three. And so, and they're, I mean, you can almost always find one, and then it's you pay based on your income. So
That's amazing.
it frees up kind of this childcare issue. And then once your child is 2.5 or potty trained, they can go into school. Here it's a preschool, but it's free. And lunches are prepared for and all sorts of, it's, yeah, it's quite a different system. Belgium's pretty similar. I worked in the Netherlands briefly, and I had a colleague who had a baby during that time, and you can have 80% work week, and then you can go breastfeed every 3 hours, go to the daycare, and then you can feed your child there if the child's close
Wow.
enough. Yeah. So,
That's amazing.
and then, you have Canada has 1 year of parental leave, and you can split it between the mom or the dad. So there's
Oh,
different countries do different things. And you're in some, I think Germany has up to 3 years parental leave. It's not paid for at like 100% pay, but you definitely do get some sort of income for that time if you choose to take it. And you can take it, I think, at different times in the first like decade, maybe, or the first 5 years of a child's life. So different countries do very different things, just so you know.
yeah. That is amazing. Because I have heard stories from other people where they're like, yeah, I kind of like dried up because I couldn't
Yeah, of course.
sustain like the pumping, and that in itself is really stressful because then I I prioritize my work more, or it's like that added pressure
Yeah.
and stress of like I wasn't able to fully provide for my child, and that in itself is stressful and
Yeah.
can contribute. So that's
And
amazing that in other countries it's a bit more I guess welcoming and accommodating.
yeah, yeah, it definitely. I mean, what we're talking about too is different factors that can essentially affect our mental health, right? Like having
Exactly.
to go back to work, which requires finding childcare, then this
Mhm.
inability to continue lactating if you want
Yep.
because of that. I mean, these are all factors. Then you have, relationship distress. Often, there's still stereotypical roles that a mother will do and a father won't do or what have you. So
Mhm.
this is even though, there's research showing that even though before having kids, they were very fair in how, they distributed household tasks, often what happens is after having a kid, that totally shifts. And a mother is doing
Exactly.
most of the physical labor, cognitive and emotional labor. I mean, I'm not blaming they're both, let's say, guilty of this because society has taught us a certain way of being. It's not that,
Right.
all of a sudden the dad decides to sit on the couch all day, but there's, moms are just like, oh yeah, and then we have to do
Yeah.
this, and then we have to do that. And so
Right.
there's a
Right.
lot of different aspects there, but there's just all these factors, right? And then if you add in, if you've had depression or anxiety before, you're at an increased risk of having it during pregnancy or
Mhm.
postpartum. And so you have that factor. And then the question about treatment, do I go back on my medication or not? And that adds another
Right.
factor.
Yes. That's
And then we
yeah.
haven't even talked about the child. So are they sleeping? Are they crying 80%
Yeah.
of their waking hour?
Right.
I mean, do they have colic? So there's just so many factors. And our society kind of piles it on, especially when you're in the States where you don't have access to childcare that's subsidized, you don't have a parental leave, right?
Exactly. Yep.
I mean, these are really big deals. And
Yeah.
so, and you also don't have health care at the same level as in other places, right? So you'll end up having that nice bill, which I remember having after baby number
Yep.
two, that you now have
Yes.
to pay, even though we had coverage, right? We had
Right.
90% coverage
Exactly.
because we were at a university. So there's a multitude of different factors that can really play into how mentally well parents are during this
Yeah.
time, right? And I think that we forget that it's not just one thing that happens that makes us tip over into mental illness. It's usually a mix of many different ones. And this is a
Absolutely.
prime time, transition to parenthood is a prime time when there's this increased vulnerability for mental illness because of so many different things that are changing
Yep.
in life.
Yeah. So many different things. And I like that you mentioned medication because there are a
Yeah.
lot of mothers who feel unease of taking their, antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication while breastfeeding and not really getting a clear answer of, can I take my medication while I'm breastfeeding? And I know you mentioned this in the book. Would you mind talking a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think, we know with most of the antidepressant medications that are the serotonin-based ones, that they're safe for use during pregnancy and in fact during lactation. This is something you can also look at the transfer of medication with something called LactMed. I think you can still look it up. It might have changed its name or changed, but it's where you find it. I don't know what the website is now, but it's a resource where you can enter in a medication and then it gives you some information on metabolism and transfer to baby and all sorts of things. So we do
Oh,
have
perfect. Yeah.
something to like refer to for that. But in general, I mean, the general consensus, and I've done a lot of research on antidepressant medications use in pregnancy and postpartum, specifically with fluoxetine or Prozac, and I've done some work with sertraline as well. And I've kept up with the clinical literature. And really, if the research has been done well, we're seeing that the medication doesn't increase the risk of poor outcomes in the child. And if the medication's working and a mother's symptoms are lessened, then that's better for everybody. And there's been some really great studies the past few years that have come out, huge studies, population-based research showing that there's not a link between antidepressant medication use in the perinatal period and an increased risk. So there's no increased risk of your child having ADHD, autism, motor difficulties. There is a link and between antidepressant use, let's say, but it's as a reflection of the severity of the mental illness. So it's likely a
Mhm.
genetic basis there,
Yeah.
and an increased risk of the child also having depression. So there is this piece, but it's likely having to do with the biology of the mental illness. So kind of
Yeah.
inheriting that from the parent, the mother and or the father. So that's one factor out there. I mean, I've just working on a perspective with regards to antidepressant medication in the
Mhm.
perinatal period and impact on mom and baby with Dr. Tim Oberlander, who is my postdoc supervisor. So hopefully that will be published in the next few months, and then you can refer to that.
Amazing. Yes.
But I think overall, if your medication's working, stay on it. Of course, talk to your healthcare provider, and if they're not helpful, you can go to the PSI website, find a perinatal psychiatrist, and they should be helpful. But yeah, the general consensus is do something so you feel better, right? And if it's
Absolutely.
medication, go for it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you. I think that
Yeah.
will help a lot of people because that is a big it's a huge concern of like, oh, I'm taking this medication, this is harming my child. And so just having that ease of I can take care of myself and I'm taking care of my child and I'm not transferring any kind of, anything that would harm my child through my breast milk. So thank
Yeah.
you. That really clarifies and I think will help ease a lot of anxiety around that.
Good. It
Um,
also hopefully will ease a lot of judgment because people also
yes.
judge you
Oh,
for it.
that's a great point. Judgment.
Yeah.
Yes.
So sometimes the
Yeah.
facts, like my book, like sometimes there's just facts in there you can just pull out and be like, no, no, there's research that shows this. Mm-mm.
Exactly.
Right. So
Yeah.
that's another
Yeah.
use for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Like if someone's watching this, just feel like Dr. Pawluski said it was fine.
Yeah. She's a
It's like
neuroscientist. She knows.
she's a neuroscientist, she's a therapist, and she's an author, and so it's all out there.
No, I try to always, of course, cite things when I say them,
Yeah,
right? So
absolutely.
I
Yeah.
think we always have to remember to go to the source, even though someone's highly educated.
Right.
Sometimes they don't always, they have their own theories, but there's definitely research, and I'm happy to provide papers with regards to, antidepressant use in pregnancy and postpartum and what have you. I think it's important to be educated about this just so that you can tell people,
Totally.
like, you know what, this is okay. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. That's so valuable. Um,
Thank
we
you.
have one last question,
Yeah.
and to wrap this amazing conversation up, what changes do you hope your research will lead in the field of perinatal mental health care?
Oh, what changes? I really, well, for one, I want us to
What
continue
are
to
your
talk.
dreams?
What are my dreams? Continue to talk about the importance of this stage in a woman's life in particular. Continue to be curious about how it affects us biologically, and not just in reference to caregiving, but also in reference to other things, right?
Right.
And just like get curious about the neurobiology and the biology of it. I think those are two big things. But really, when it comes to perinatal mental illness, I would hope that we can use our scientific understanding to develop and implement more interventions and preventative measures, right? And I think sometimes, part of me is just like, we know a lot of what can be helpful, but we haven't actually provided those options to mothers or parents. And so there's research showing that different aspects of social support can be helpful. Access to therapy can be helpful. But we're not providing it, right, as a
Yes.
society. And so I think I would love to see more changes at the policy level to really support and value this transition in a person's life, because we don't value caregiving, right? We don't
Yeah,
value parenting, but we
exactly.
depend on it for our society, but we're not doing
Right.
very much to support it. And so I'm hoping that this will really change a lot in the coming years in particular, and moms will really get the support that they deserve.
That's so beautifully said. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, we really want to thank you, Dr. Paluski, for joining FFDA. The information that you provided in this interview is really valuable, and we are so looking forward to adding this on our accounts and for families to be able to learn from you from this interview, but also from your book, which has so many valuable information. And we highly recommend for viewers to read that book. And would you also mind sharing? You also have a podcast, correct?
I do. I also have a podcast called Mommy Brain Revisited, and it's a podcast where I interview other researchers around the neuroscience of parenthood and perinatal mental illness. So it comes out, a new episode will be coming out next month. I usually do every month a new episode with a different researcher related to some
Okay.
of their really interesting research, and so you can really hear from them what what they're doing, right? And we often have a chat, of course, with how this, maybe is impactful for parents and perinatal mental health professionals and what have you. But it's a way of getting, access to the research that's being done. And yeah, it's been fun for me to provide this and to do it and have some great chats with some really brilliant
Definitely.
people.
Amazing. Are there, to wrap it up, are there locations that people can go to learn more about your podcast, your book, and if there is anything that is coming out? You said that you're coming out with a publication in the next few months.
Yeah, so you can find me on my website, jodipawluski.com. You can find a lot of information there. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Jodi Pawluski, and I'm on Twitter at Jodi Pawluski. Where else am I? I'm also on LinkedIn, not as active. I'm everywhere somewhere, but I'm most active probably on Instagram, and then most resources easy to find on my website. I also will be doing, starting in the fall, I'm going to be doing a training for perinatal health professionals with regards to understanding the neuroscience of parenting and perinatal mental health through the Canadian Perinatal Mental Health Trainings organization. It's obviously open to everyone, not just Canadians, but that will be coming out. The call for that will be coming out in a month or so. So people can register if they're interested in learning more about how the brain changes, of course, with parenthood and perinatal mental illness, and how to kind of take that with us as we work as professionals in the field. So I have that going on as well soon. And I'm also
Amazing.
always publishing. So I
Yes.
try to post about it on Instagram and what have you. So those are kind of, yeah, some of the things I'm doing. So
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Paluski. And we are so excited and so grateful for you taking the time to speak with us and to share all of the information in this conversation. And we are so looking forward to learning more and reading up more of your work. So thank
thank
you.
you.
Really
Thank you. It was a
appreciate
pleasure
it.
to be here. And if anyone has questions, please feel free to contact me about anything we talked about or anything else. But thank you so much, Rose, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Likewise.
Thank
Thank you.